Imagine waking up one morning to find out that Africa has just rewritten aviation history overnight. A flight, not just any flight, but a continent-defying journey from Zimbabwe all the way to Cairo, completed using a new aviation model that experts said would take decades to achieve. Yet somehow it has happened now, and the world is paying attention. This is Africa's new aviation milestone, a breakthrough that signals something much bigger than a simple flight path. It represents a shift, an awakening, an announcement to the world that African innovation is not waiting for permission anymore. It's moving, it's building, it's taking off. But what exactly made this Zimbabwe to Cairo flight so historic? The aircraft wasn't just flying a new route. It wasn't just connecting two major cities. And it wasn't just another addition to Africa's aviation map. This journey symbolized a new era of continental ambition, a moment where African engineers, pilots, policymakers, and investors aligned behind a single mission: to prove that Africa can innovate, operate, and lead on its own terms. The story begins months before the takeoff, when a quiet collaboration between Southern African and North African aviation authorities sparked a surprising idea. Could Africa create a long-range intercontinental flight model entirely planned, crewed, and executed by African professionals? Most observers dismissed it. Too ambitious, too expensive, too complex. But behind closed doors, a focused team continued working, refining flight plans, studying jet stream routes, testing navigation systems, and upgrading communication links across airspaces. Slowly, the impossible began to take shape. And then came the morning that changed everything. At dawn, under a sky painted in soft gold, the aircraft rolled onto the runway in Harare. The engines ignited with a deep, confident growl. The cockpit crew performed a final systems check. The control tower gave clearance. Cameras were ready. Eyes were watching. Expectations were rising. As the aircraft accelerated forward, something unusual happened. Something the pilots later described as a moment of collective realization. This wasn't just a takeoff. This was Africa lifting itself. Within minutes, the plane climbed into the clouds, carving a path northward over Zambia, Sudan, and onward toward Egypt. But what the world didn't know yet was that this flight wasn't just proving a route. It was testing a series of innovations developed through African-led aviation programs, innovations that could drastically change future air travel across the continent. One of the most remarkable of these innovations involved a newly optimized fuel efficiency system, developed through a collaboration between Zimbabwean aeronautical engineers and North African flight energy researchers. This system wasn't some futuristic fantasy. It was a refined, data-driven upgrade that allowed the aircraft to reduce fuel burn on long-range routes by adapting in real time to Africa's highly diverse climate zones. Hot air over the savanna, cooler streams above the Sahara, shifting winds along the Nile corridor. The aircraft adjusted itself continuously, almost like it could feel the atmosphere. As the plane moved northward, the cockpit crew monitored the system carefully. Every reading looked promising. For the first time, an African-developed flight optimization model was performing beyond expectations on a full-scale mission. But that wasn't the only breakthrough on board. Behind the cockpit, a quiet hum flowed through the cabin walls, another innovation at work. A next-generation communication link designed specifically for Africa's vast and often disconnected airspaces. Traditional aviation communication systems struggle across long stretches of the continent due to limited ground infrastructure. But on this flight, the aircraft didn't rely solely on standard relay points. Instead, it used a hybrid system combining satellite microlink upgrades with regionally enhanced signal nodes. The result? Continuous, crystal-clear connectivity from Harare all the way to the Egyptian border. The crew later said that not a single communication dropout occurred during the entire journey, a rarity even for major international carriers. And yet, perhaps the most symbolic breakthrough wasn't technological at all. It was the collaboration behind the mission. On board were representatives from multiple African nations, aviation officials, engineers, observers, all witnessing the start of something bigger than any single country. The flight wasn't just connecting Zimbabwe to Cairo. It was connecting visions, ambitions, and futures. As the aircraft crossed into Sudanese airspace, a soft glow of the desert sunrise painted the horizon below. The journey had reached its midpoint. But even now, the mission's success was not guaranteed. All systems were stable, but the real test lay ahead. The final high-precision descent into Cairo, through one of North Africa's busiest air corridors. The pilots prepared to initiate the next stage of the journey, one that would determine whether this flight would become a historic milestone or simply a bold attempt. And as the plane approached the northern edge of the Sahara, the entire team braced for the most challenging phase yet. Navigating Cairo's dense, fast-moving airspace, a region where military traffic, commercial flights, and private jets often overlap within minutes of one another. The crew knew this was where the new African-built communication system had to prove itself, not in theory, not in simulation, but in the real, high-pressure environment of one of the busiest aviation hubs in the Middle East, North Africa region. As the aircraft neared Egyptian airspace, the radio crackled briefly, then stabilized instantly. The new hybrid communication link locked onto Cairo's control tower with stunning precision. No delay, no distortion, no interference. For a moment, the cabin fell into a quiet sense of triumph. This wasn't supposed to be possible, not with Africa's fragmented air infrastructure, not with a brand new tech system on its first long-range test. But it was working flawlessly. Cairo ATC acknowledged the aircraft with a tone that could only be described as impressed. Zimbabwe 179er, communication link confirmed, proceed with northern approach vector. Inside the cockpit, the pilots exchanged a glance that carried months of effort, pressure, and unspoken hope. The descent began. Outside the window, the desert gave way to the winding patterns of civilization, the Nile stretching like a ribbon through the landscape, shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. Below them lay the busiest air gateway in North Africa, and every second of the descent would demand precision. But as the aircraft leveled into its approach arc, another milestone quietly unfolded. The stability system, another African innovation, activated automatically, smoothing turbulence using layered wind data mapped from multiple African regions. Instead of the usual shaking and pressure changes, the cabin felt unusually calm. Passengers looked around, surprised at the gentle descent, unaware they were experiencing a newly developed African turbulence mitigation algorithm in action. The aircraft pierced through the cloud layer. Cairo grew larger beneath them. The runway alignment indicators glowed bright on the horizon. For the final 2 minutes, the cockpit was silent. Only the soft clicks of instruments and the rhythmic beep of altitude readings. Then, with a smoothness that even veteran pilots would envy, the wheels touched the runway. Not a jolt, not a skid, a perfect landing. Cheers erupted inside the aircraft. Not loud, but emotional, the kind of quiet, heartfelt celebration shared by people who know they have just done something that will echo across a generation. As the plane slowed and taxied toward the terminal, ground crews stopped what they were doing. Some clapped. Some pulled out phones to record the moment. Others simply stared, aware that they were witnessing the birth of a new African chapter. A voice from the back of the aircraft said what everyone else was thinking. This isn't just a flight, this is a message. And indeed it was. A message that Africa could innovate. A message that Africa could unite. A message that Africa could lead its own aviation future. But the story doesn't end on the runway. Because what happened after the aircraft parked, what unfolded once the doors opened, would shock even the most optimistic supporters of this mission. The moment the aircraft door swung open, the atmosphere shifted. A wave of warm Cairo air poured in, along with a wall of flashing cameras, journalists pushing forward, and officials waiting in formation. But it wasn't the usual ceremonial welcome. No red carpets. No scripted speeches. This was different, because standing at the front of the reception line were delegates from 6 different African aviation authorities, all of whom had flown in, some on extremely short notice, to witness what they now openly called the turning point. As the delegation stepped forward, One Egyptian official leaned in and said quietly to the Zimbabwean mission lead, "You didn't just complete a flight. You just proved a continent can rewrite its own rules." Within minutes, the crew was escorted into a private briefing lounge, not for celebrations, but for something far more urgent. Inside the room, maps were spread across tables. Screens displayed live diagnostics from the aircraft. And waiting for them were engineers, policymakers, and industry experts from across Africa. The door closed behind them. What happened next was not part of the original plan. An Ethiopian systems specialist pointed at the telemetry from the experimental communication link. "This stability, this clarity, we've never seen this across northern corridors. How did you maintain signal integrity through the Sinai crosswinds?" A Kenyan engineer jumped in, tapping her tablet. "And your turbulence mitigation algorithm, look at this. It predicted the microgusts near Luxor 7 minutes before Cairo's own sensors registered them." Murmurs filled the room. Africa had expected a successful landing, but not technology outperforming major global benchmarks. Not this level of precision. Not this level of reliability. Then the Ugandan Aviation Commissioner said what everyone was thinking. "If Africa can do this, we don't need to buy upgrades. We can build them." Silence. A powerful silence. The kind that shifts the energy in the room. But just as discussions grew heated, the Zimbabwean mission commander raised a hand. "We appreciate the praise," he said calmly. "But you need to understand, this flight almost didn't happen." The room leaned in. There were forces, let's call them external interests, that were watching us very closely. Not everyone wants Africa to become aviation independent. A ripple of concern moved across the table. But the commander wasn't finished. "You saw the clean telemetry. But what you didn't see..." He tapped the screen. A new graph appeared, showing a brief, sharp spike in system interference north of Sudan. Almost invisible unless you knew where to look. "That wasn't weather," he said quietly. "That was a targeted disruption." The entire room froze. Engineers stared at the data. Officials exchanged shocked glances. Someone whispered, "Who would do that?" The Zimbabwean pilot took a deep breath. "That's why we need to talk, not just about celebrating this mission, but about what comes next." He looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes. Because this flight wasn't just a milestone. It was a warning. The room fell into total silence. Right before the Sudanese delegate slowly stood up, his expression serious. He pointed toward the hangar outside the glass window. "You think that was the end?" he said quietly. "Look outside." The group turned, and what they saw waiting on the tarmac was something none of them had been informed about. Something unexpected. Something impossible. Something that would change the conversation completely. Outside the glass window, illuminated by the floodlights, was a second aircraft. But this one wasn't painted in Zimbabwean colors, or Egyptian colors, or any national livery. Its body was matte gray. No flags. No registration numbers. No identification markings at all. Just a sleek, unfamiliar silhouette. And a crew of technicians surrounding it like a classified military project. For a moment, no one in the briefing room said a word. Then the Sudanese delegate broke the silence. "That aircraft arrived 30 minutes before you landed," he said. "No flight plan. No transponder. No radio contact. Yet it passed through airspace that normally requires 6 layers of clearance." Eyes widened around the room. The Kenyan engineer whispered, "Is it one of ours?" The Sudanese delegate shook his head. "No." And that's exactly the problem. The Zimbabwean commander stepped closer to the window, his face hardening as he studied the mysterious craft. The shape, the wing profile, the sensor array under its belly. It was too advanced, too quiet, too deliberate. "This isn't a demonstration," he muttered. "This is surveillance." A murmur of anxiety rippled through the group. The Egyptian aviation minister leaned forward. "Surveillance of what? Our aircraft? Our systems? Our cooperation?" The Sudanese delegate's voice dropped. "Surveillance of Africa waking up." Everyone felt the weight of that sentence. But before the room could process the implications, the Zimbabwean pilot's tablet buzzed. "Urgent alert." He glanced at the notification and his eyes went cold. "Everyone," he said, "look at this." He tapped the screen, projecting the message onto the display. It was a satellite feed, time-stamped just minutes ago, showing the same unknown aircraft departing from an offshore platform in the Red Sea. Not a military base. Not an airport. A platform, floating, unregistered, positioned exactly under Africa's northern flight corridor. The Ethiopian specialist frowned. "That's not just surveillance. That's coordination." The commander exhaled slowly. "And that means our experimental flight wasn't just observed. It was triggering a response." A sharp knock hit the door. Everyone turned. A security officer stepped inside, breathing quickly. "Sir, there's something you need to see on the main runway." Without hesitation, the delegation rushed out of the briefing room and moved toward the viewing deck as alarms began quietly buzzing throughout the facility. They reached the window overlooking the runway and froze. Parked beside the mysterious gray aircraft was a transport truck carrying a sealed container. Not large, not marked, but guarded by armed personnel who absolutely did not belong to Cairo's aviation security. The Kenyan engineer whispered, voice trembling, "What is in that container?" The Zimbabwean mission commander clenched his jaw. "I don't know." He looked at his team, then back at the container. "But whatever it is, it's not here by accident." The Sudanese delegate swallowed hard. "Then we must decide, right now, whether we're dealing with a threat." He paused, eyes narrowing, or an invitation. The group stared at the sealed container, engines humming in the distance, Cairo lights shimmering beyond the runway. And in that tense, electric moment, every one of them understood. Africa's historic flight had awakened something much bigger, much older, and far more complex than any of them were prepared for. But this was only the beginning. The group moved quickly down to the edge of the runway, escorted by security. Dust swirled under the floodlights. The sealed container sat silent, guarded, almost expectant. The Zimbabwean commander stepped forward, shoulders squared. "No more guessing," he said. "We end this tonight." The lead guard, face stern, uniform unfamiliar, blocked his path. "This cargo is restricted." The Egyptian aviation minister lifted his badge. "Restricted to whom?" "This is our airfield." A tense stare-down followed. For a moment, it looked like no one would budge. Then, to everyone's shock, the guard stepped aside. "No one is stopping you," he said quietly. "But once you open it, you cannot unsee what's inside." The lock unlatched with a heavy metallic click. The container doors swung open. A faint blue glow spilled out, lighting the faces of the delegation. Inside was a prototype engine. But not just any engine. A hybrid propulsion unit unlike anything they had ever seen. No moving pistons, no turbine fans, no combustion system. A silent core surrounded by induction coils, energy regulators, and a magnetic confinement ring. The Ethiopian specialist gasped. "This is impossible. This design is at least 20 years ahead of what any African state has." The Kenyan engineer stepped closer, eyes reflecting the glow. "It's not for monitoring us," she whispered. "It's for us." The Sudanese delegate turned to the guard. "Who sent this?" The guard hesitated, then handed over a sealed envelope. The Zimbabwean commander tore it open. Inside were only 4 words. "Africa must move first." No signature. No sender. No explanation. Just a message. And a blueprint waiting to change everything. Silence fell across the group as they realized the truth. The mysterious aircraft wasn't a threat. The interference spike wasn't an attack. The offshore platform wasn't surveillance. They were signals. Signals meant to test whether Africa was ready to step into a new era of aviation, not led by foreign powers, not dependent on imported systems, but built, tested, and mastered by Africans themselves. The commander closed the container gently. "This," he said, voice steady, "is why our flight mattered." He looked at the team from across the continent, engineers, pilots, policymakers, each of them shaken but inspired. "We proved we could cross Africa's sky on our own terms. Now someone is challenging us to go further." The Egyptian minister nodded slowly. Then, we accept the challenge. The group walked back toward the hangar. Not with fear, but with a sense of purpose. The night air felt different now. Charged.
New.
Because Africa's historic flight from Zimbabwe to Cairo was no longer just a milestone. It had become the opening chapter of a new aviation revolution. And for the first time in generations, Africa wasn't following the world. Africa was leading.